The night after Knox's rider left, the ranch was wrapped in uneasy silence. Clara sat by the fire, watching the flames dance across Eli's weathered face. He sat in his usual chair, boots planted firmly on the floor, rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach. He looked like a man who had been expecting this confrontation his whole life, like someone who had made peace with the idea that death could come knocking any day. Clara couldn't stop herself from speaking. "Why risk your life for me? You don't even know me." Eli turned his head slowly, his eyes dark as the plains beyond the window. "I don't need to know you," he said. "I know men like Knox. And I know what it feels like to watch them take everything until there's nothing left. I won't watch it again." Her chest tightened. She had spent years believing no one would ever stand between her and the cruelty of men who thought they owned the world. She didn't understand Eli's silence, his stubborn calm, the way he never demanded gratitude. It frightened her more than rage or violence ever had. And yet, deep down, something fragile stirred, the dangerous seed of trust. Still, the fear in her ribs pulsed like a second heartbeat. Knox would come. Men like him never let go of what they claimed. 3 days later, that fear proved true. Dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Riders, a dozen at least, their silhouettes cutting across the setting sun. Clara's breath caught. She had seen Knox's men before, their swagger, their cruelty, their laughter that carried like knives in the night. She wanted to run, to disappear into the endless prairie, but Eli's voice stopped her. "You're staying here. This is your home now." His words were final, ironclad. He stepped onto the porch as the riders approached, his rifle resting casually in his hands as though it was an extension of his body. Knox Henley himself rode at the front, his wide-brimmed hat tilted, his grin sharp and cruel. He was a man who had grown fat off other people's fear, who never heard the word, no, without crushing it under his heel. "Ward," Knox drawled, pulling his horse to a stop just beyond the porch. "You've got something of mine. I've come to collect." The men behind him chuckled, the sound low and threatening. Eli didn't move, didn't blink. "The girl's free," he said. "She ain't yours, and she sure as hell ain't mine. She stays." The smile slid from Knox's face like oil across water. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice turning cold. "Everything out here belongs to me one way or another. Women, land, cattle, law. You think you're different, Eli? You think you can hide behind your fences and tell me no?" Eli finally raised the rifle, not aimed yet, just resting across his chest. "This ranch has nothing you want, Knox, except a fight. And if that's what you came for, you better think hard, because I don't aim to lose." The silence that followed was sharp as a blade, broken only by the restless shifting of horses. Clara, hidden just inside the doorway, felt her knees weaken. She had prayed for death before, begged for an end to her suffering, but now she prayed for Eli to live. She had only just begun to believe that kindness could exist in a man, and the thought of Knox stealing that away filled her with a rage she didn't know she possessed. When Knox finally laughed, it was the sound of a snake coiling. "You've got grit, Ward. But grit won't stop a storm. I'll give you until sundown tomorrow. Bring her to me, or I'll burn this ranch to the ground with both of you inside." With that, he yanked the reins, and his men wheeled their horses, riding off in a cloud of dust that choked the air. The silence that remained was worse than their threats. Eli lowered his rifle, jaw clenched tight. Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling. "You can't fight him," she whispered. "He owns too many guns, too many men. He'll kill you." Eli's eyes found hers, steady as stone. "Then he'll find out a man can still fight with nothing but his ground under his boots and a reason in his heart." He moved past her, already preparing, checking ammunition, sharpening his knife, tying his horse tighter. Every movement was calm, deliberate. He wasn't reckless. He was resolved. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, listening to the scrape of Eli's boots outside as he walked the perimeter of the ranch. She thought of all the times she had been powerless, all the nights she had wished someone, anyone, would stand for her. Now that someone had, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him to her cursed shadow. Quietly, she rose, walked outside, and found him leaning against the corral fence under the stars. "You shouldn't do this," she whispered. "You should let me go. If I run, maybe they'll follow me and leave you alone." Eli turned, the starlight carving hard lines across his face. "I didn't pay that $1 to let you keep running. I paid it so you'd stop." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, a crack that revealed the ache buried in his chest. Clara stared at him, Words caught in her throat. She realized then that Eli wasn't just defying Knox. He was defying the loneliness that had caged them both, him in silence, her in pain. And suddenly, she wanted to stand with him, not as a burden, not as a prize, but as someone who still had a voice left to raise. When dawn broke, the horizon bled red with the rising sun. Eli saddled his horse, rifle slung across his back. Clara stepped outside, her torn dress hidden beneath the old coat he had given her, her face pale but steady. "You're not facing them alone," she said, her voice shaking but sure. Eli studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. They both knew the odds. They both knew Knox would not stop until he crushed them. But for the first time, Clara didn't feel like prey. She felt like a flame, fragile yet burning, and beside her stood a man ready to set the whole West alight to protect it. As the sun climbed higher, riders appeared again, darker, angrier, armed for blood. Eli tightened his grip on the reins. Clara stood at his side, one hand clutching the coat around her shoulders, the other clenched into a fist. The storm was coming, and this time, she wasn't begging for death. She was begging for survival, for freedom, for a chance to live. The ground shook beneath the hooves of Knox Hanley's riders as they descended on the ranch like a dark tide, dust curling into the morning air. Eli stood tall on the porch, rifle steady in his grip, while Clara remained just behind him, her hand clutching the wood of the doorway so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could hear the laughter of the men, the cruel confidence of predators certain they were closing in on easy prey. But Eli didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on Knox, who rode at the front, cigar clenched between his teeth, his smile wide as though he had already won. Knox pulled his horse to a stop just short of the fence, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Last chance, Ward, hand her over, and I might let you keep this pile of dirt you call a ranch." His men chuckled behind him, fingers tapping on their revolvers, the smell of whiskey and gunpowder rolling off them in waves. Eli slowly raised his rifle, the barrel gleaming in the sun. "This land isn't for sale. Neither is she, and I told you before, she's free." His words rang out, not like a boast, but like a truth carved into stone. The moment hung suspended, silence pressing down so thick even the horses snorted uneasily. Then Knox spat his cigar into the dust and sneered, "So be it." He raised his hand, and his men fanned out, surrounding the ranch. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as she saw guns flash in the sunlight. She wanted to scream, to beg Eli to back down, but the look on his face stopped her. It was not recklessness, it was the fierce calm of a man who had already made peace with what came next. The first shot cracked the morning wide open, ringing across the plains. Eli's rifle answered in the same breath, one of Knox's riders tumbling from his saddle before he even drew his pistol. Chaos erupted, gunfire split the air, bullets slamming into fence posts, windows, the walls of the old house. Eli moved with the precision of a man who had lived a lifetime preparing for this moment, his shots deliberate, his body a shield between Clara and the storm outside. Every time she flinched, he held his ground, never once stepping back. Clara could only watch, her fear colliding with something fiercer inside her. She remembered every night Knox's men had laughed at her pain, every moment she had begged for mercy that never came. Now Eli was standing against them, alone, because he believed she was worth more than chains. The thought seared through her, and before she realized it, her trembling hands found the revolver Eli had left on the table by the door. She gripped it tightly, her body shaking, but her jaw set. She would not hide in shadows anymore. The gunfight dragged on, the ranch yard littered with fallen men and spooked horses. Knox cursed, fury twisting his features as he realized Eli would not break. "You're a dead man, Ward," he roared, firing wildly. Eli ducked behind the porch rail, returning fire with calm precision. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Clara stepped forward, the revolver in her hand. She raised it, arms trembling but eyes steady, and fired. The shot rang true, grazing Knox's arm and knocking him off balance. The gang leader bellowed in rage and disbelief, his men faltering at the sight of a woman they thought broken standing tall with fire in her eyes. That moment of hesitation was all Eli needed. His rifle cracked again, and Knox's pistol flew from his hand, landing uselessly in the dirt. The ranch fell into silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the retreat of those who had lost their nerve. Knox, clutching his bleeding arm, glared up at Eli and Clara with venom. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You'll regret crossing me." But his words rang hollow now, his power cracked like glass under the weight of their defiance. When he finally staggered onto his horse and rode off, the rest of his men scattered, the mighty storm reduced to dust on the horizon. Clara lowered the revolver, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. Eli turned to her, his rifle still in hand, his face unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another, the echo of gunfire still ringing in their ears. Then, quietly, Eli stepped forward and took the revolver from her trembling fingers, setting it gently aside. "You did good," he said softly. "You stood." Clara's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks as the weight of everything crashed over her. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "But for once, I didn't want to run." Eli reached out then, his rough hand brushing against her cheek, the first time he had touched her without fear of shattering her fragile trust. "You don't have to run anymore," he murmured. "Not from him, not from anyone." The words broke something inside her, but not in pain, in release. She fell into his arms, sobbing against his chest, while he held her steady, his own silence finally filled with purpose. For the first time in years, the lonely ranch was no longer empty. It was a sanctuary, a place where two broken souls had chosen to stand together. As the sun dipped low and the prairie wind carried away the last of the smoke, Clara lifted her head and looked out across the battered ranch yard. It wasn't much, fences broken, windows shattered, blood in the dust. But it was theirs, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Eli followed her gaze, his expression still hard, but his arm never leaving her shoulders. "They'll come again," he said quietly. "Men like Knox don't forgive easy." Clara nodded, her eyes fierce through the tears. "Then let them. This time, I won't beg them to make it quick. I'll fight." And in that moment, under the wide and endless sky of the west, two people who had once been nothing more than shadows stood together in the light. The dollar Eli had paid meant nothing to the world, but to Clara it had bought back her soul. To Eli, it had given him a reason to fight again. And to both of them, it was the beginning of something unthinkable, hope. The days that followed were filled with a silence heavier than gunfire. The ranch bore its scars, shattered glass, bullet holes in the porch, blood soaked into the dust where Knox's men had fallen. Eli worked quietly, repairing what could be fixed, burning what needed to be buried. Clara watched him, her ribs still aching but her spirit steadier than it had ever been. For the first time in her life, no one was demanding her voice, her body, or her obedience. The only thing Eli asked of her was to eat, to rest, and when she was ready, to walk with him into the sun without fear. But peace was a fragile thing in the West. The town soon learned of the standoff at Ward's ranch. Stories spread quickly, how the silent rancher had defied Knox Hanley, how a woman thought Broken had raised a gun against him. Some called Eli a fool for crossing Knox. Others whispered that maybe the rancher was something more than a recluse, maybe he was the last honest man in a land ruled by greed. Clara heard the talk when she rode into town with Eli one morning for supplies. The stares burned into her, some filled with pity, others with awe. She kept her chin high, clutching Eli's arm as though it was her anchor in the storm. Knox himself did not return right away. Wounded pride was a dangerous wound, and men like him never forgot an insult. Yet weeks passed, and the horizon remained empty of riders. Clara began to breathe easier, though she never let go of the revolver Eli had given her. At night, she would practice with it behind the barn, hands trembling less with every shot. Eli watched from a distance, never correcting her aim, never judging. When she asked him why, he said simply, "You already know what you're fighting for. The rest will come." One evening, as the sky bled purple with dusk, Clara sat beside Eli on the porch, her voice soft but certain. "I used to think I wasn't worth saving. That even if someone tried, I'd only drag them down with me." Eli didn't look at her, just stared out at the horizon with that steady calm of his. "You were worth saving the second I saw you," he said. "I just had to make you believe it." Her throat tightened, and for the first time, she reached for his hand. The silence between them shifted, no longer lonely, but full. Yet even as the ranch grew into a place of quiet healing, the shadow of Knox lingered. Travelers brought word of him nursing his pride in the saloons, his men restless, his empire fraying at the edges. Some said he was planning his revenge, others whispered he had lost his nerve after being stood down by a rancher and a woman. Clara knew better. Men like Knox didn't fade quietly. They waited, they watched, and when the time came, they struck harder. But instead of fear, she felt something new in her chest, a burning will. She wasn't prey anymore, she was fire. The turning point came on a Sunday morning, when Eli and Clara rode into town together for the first time since the fight. The saloon doors swung open, conversation stilled, and every eye turned to them. Clara's heart hammered, but Eli walked with his usual unshaken stride, tipping his hat only once, to an old widow who smiled faintly at him. Knox wasn't there, but his shadow hung heavy in the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, Clara spoke, clear, steady, louder than the whispers. "I'm not his anymore, and if he comes for me again, I won't hide." The hush that followed was like thunder. For once, the town heard her voice not as entertainment, not as weakness, but as defiance. The lawman who had once turned a blind eye began shifting uneasily. The townsfolk who had pitied her began to see something stronger in her eyes. And in that moment, something in the balance of power shifted. Knox Hanley was still feared, but fear alone no longer ruled. One rancher's stand, and one woman's courage, had cracked the spell. Eli didn't smile, didn't boast, but when they left the saloon together, Clara saw the pride in his eyes, and it filled her with a warmth deeper than any applause she had ever known. Back at the ranch, life became something almost ordinary. Eli repaired the barn roof. Clara planted wildflowers near the fence line, their colors defiant against the dust. At night, they sat by the fire, speaking little, yet saying everything in the way their shoulders brushed, in the way silence became comfort instead of isolation. For Clara, every day was proof that she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And for Eli, every sunrise reminded him that his dollar had bought him not just a fight, but a reason to keep going. Months later, when Knox finally returned under cover of night, drunk and vengeful with only a handful of loyal men, the ranch was ready. He expected fear. Instead, he found light in the windows, rifles waiting by the doors, and two figures standing together on the porch. Eli didn't even raise his rifle. Clara did, and though she never pulled the trigger, the sight of her standing steady, eyes unyielding, was enough to drive Knox into the darkness where he belonged. For the first time in his life, Knox Hanley knew he had lost, not to bullets, but to courage. Years later, the story was still told in whispers across the West. How a lonely rancher paid $1 for a woman no one wanted. How that woman, broken and bruised, rose to stand beside him. How together they defied a man who thought he owned everything. But for Eli and Clara, it wasn't legend. It was simply life. A life built not on fear, but on the unthinkable gift of choosing each other. And every time Clara's ribs ached when she laughed, she touched Eli's hand and remembered, she had once begged for the end. Now, she begged only for more days in the light.